Chapter 12 Belgium. Degrelle. The history of Rex and of its living embodiment, Leon Degrelle, is typical of a fascist movement in a Western democracy. A country whose problems were in no way dramatic and whose people, solid and often stolid, inclined neither to excesses nor to histrionics. Leon Degrelle was born in 1906 at Walloon in the Ardennes, Shakespeare's Forest of Arden, close to the French border. He came from a family which, as a Belgian bishop maliciously expressed it, produced Jesuits from father to son. Leon's father was born near Maubeuge, in northern France, and his mother's family came from German-speaking Moselle. But the Degrelles were an old clan, widespread throughout the lowland countries that had once been part of a greater Burgundy and which Degrelle would one day try to reintegrate. The boy soon discovered the ideas of the French monarchist and reactionary, Action Française, a very popular movement in the Belgium of the early 20s, particularly among the Jesuits and other teaching orders in Catholic schools. From the Action Française newspaper and its polemicist, Leon Degrelle, Degrelle drew the verve and the biting droll and brilliant style of his own polemics. But it was Charles Maurras who affected him most. From him, Degrelle learned to despise democracy, the stupidity of the masses and of majority rule, the irresponsibility and corruption of parliamentary assemblies. Maurras's arguments convinced him that order, competence, continuity, and responsibility, capped by one keystone, monarchy, were the only foundation on which to build a viable state. Though by the age of 21 he had broken loose from the Action Française, these ideas were to stay with him and to provide the basis of Rex's doctrine. The flamboyant movement of the middle 30s had its origins in a small Catholic publishing firm, Christus Rex, launched under the auspices of the ACJB, in brackets, Catholic Association of Belgian Youth, end brackets, whose management Degrelle undertook in 1930. From his tiny offices in the Louvain headquarters of the ACJB, Degrelle showered Belgium with pamphlets, posters, and periodicals destined, in quotations, to renovate Christian life, end quotation. It is important to remember that Degrelle always remained a keen practicing Catholic, and that his first motives were those of many other young men who set out to assert high-minded principles, in brackets, and themselves, of course, end brackets, in the junkyard of fudge and compromise, where the older generation seems to be contented. Catholic action, apostolic spirit, the rejuvenation of Catholicism and thus of Belgium sound like admirable aspirations, at least for Catholics. Such sentiments, however, only too often end in condemnation, compromise, or abandon. At any rate, they are bound to seek political expression sooner or later. Rex. This is what happened with the young men of Christus Rex. Their ideals sought a political expression, but politics of an active and reformist kind were difficult in a country where political differences had become particularly shallow, and no political party, in brackets, except that of the Flemish nationalists who demanded regional autonomy, end brackets, seemed to have a well-defined policy. Ever since 1914, Belgium had been ruled by coalitions, Catholic, liberal, and socialist, or socialist-Catholic, before whose pragmatic convenience ideologies had withered away. Their doctrines increasingly forgotten, the parties had traded whatever enthusiasm they might have once had for practical economic and administrative concerns. Young Belgian intellectuals, eager for an idea, found only pragmatic materialism. Against this background of political meaninglessness, many welcomed Rex's attempt to revive the feeling that meaningful action was possible, and Rexist insistence that Rex was a movement, a living part of life. In brackets, see reading number 7a, end brackets. Before it did anything else, this insistence on movement alone, In brackets and quotations, Rex is not a party and does not want to be one. It is an enormous sentimental movement. Rex is a movement. That is, an act of force, carrying a current of ideas, end quotation, end bracket. Gave both followers and leaders a sense of activity and, almost, a sense of achievement. But such a feeling had to be reinforced by action. Degrelle and his friends, few of them over 25, had sought at first to express themselves through the existing Catholic Party. They had found it sclerotic, deeply committed to the existing system, its integrity corrupted by the, in quotations, banksters, end quotations, and its leaders involved in the very frauds and swindles Rex wanted to sweep away. Degrelle's denunciations of corrupt politicians, particularly his attack on the president of the Catholic Party and Minister of State, Segers, forced him to break with the ACJB. It was at this time that Rex adopted the broom as its most characteristic device, and sent troops of young men to sweep the pavement outside the headquarters of various parties, especially the Catholic Party, and outside the Parliament building. In late 1935, having antagonized practically every organized political force in the country, Rex stood alone, its chief and almost its only assets being the extraordinary dynamism of Leon Degrelle, a devoted organizational network covering the country on a shoestring, and the drab flabbiness of the men it opposed. In a country where political meetings hardly ever drew more than a few hundred people, thousands came and paid admission to hear Degrelle. They packed meetings which Rex always staged with impressive displays of banners, bands, searchlights, and massed groups of guards. To a public bored by the petty issues of local politics and disinclined to believe that even these could be coped with by the ruling cliques, the Rexist speakers held another language, more elevating, more inspiring. The world, they said, was rotten with selfishness and greed. Only those could save it who were willing to sacrifice themselves every day, transcend the preoccupations of their little lives in order to fulfill a higher, grander goal. To a largely bourgeois public, Rex spoke in violently anti-bourgeois tones, even its anti-communism becoming an excuse to attack the conservative enemies not only of communism, but of the country's welfare. In quotations, "We are not the sort to exploit the funk of frightened bourgeois by telling them that communism and revolution are one. We are those who, having nothing to lose and everything to win, have decided to replace the decaying liberal regime with a new regime, and to create a world in which a man can truly live. We can expect nothing from the present regime against which we are not in open insurrection. We would not write a line, we would not say a word, we would not shed a drop of our blood to defend it, and if it was a question of consolidating it, let us tell you frankly, at the risk of scandalizing the weak, that we would just as soon have a communist regime." End quotation. Rexist opposition to communism itself was based on the belief that Marxism was a leftover of decaying liberalism. To the capitalism of the banksters, communism substituted a state capitalism just as one-sided and oppressive. In every other way, argued José Striel, in brackets, who would be shot at the liberation, end brackets, the communists merely developed the themes of the existing regime. In quotations, communism is not revolution against established disorder, but simply the extension of this disorder and the exasperation of its essential vices, end quotation. And Degrelle, in quotations, "To break the neck of communism will get us nowhere if we do not also break the neck of the social selfishness that gave it birth." End quotation. In quotations, it was by calling for devotion, by exalting renunciation, abnegation, purity, labor, the will to serve, end quotation, wrote La Nation Belge, a none too friendly Brussels daily. In quotations, that Degrelle wrung the loudest applause from the crowd of average Belgians, tradesmen, workers, clerks, petty bourgeois. Our fathers would have been amazed to see this. End quotation. In brackets, see reading number 7b. End brackets. Rival party politicians also were amazed. Success. The movement's publications supported its propaganda. The weekly Rex appeared in 3 editions, French for the Walloons, Flemish and German for the population of Eupen and Malmedy, in brackets, formerly German territory, end brackets, annexed in 1918. A daily, Buriel, in brackets, a title of Maurrassian inspiration, opposing the real nation to its merely legal, formal institutions, end brackets, printed over 200,000 copies on weekdays and 1 million on Sundays. The second half of 1936 also saw the foundation of a Flemish-language daily, Die Neue Staat, for Rex wanted to reconcile the country's bitterly antagonistic linguistic groups. All this cost money, and Rex could not look for support from the financial interests it lambasted daily. After its electoral success, business interests would run to help, and one great industrialist alone would send 2 million francs, in brackets, about $1.5 million today, end brackets, to cover 120,000 subscriptions to Buriel, but at first, reasonable people both feared and discounted the possibility of such successes. Rex's funds came from the admission fees to its meetings, in brackets, none of which were free, end brackets, and from Italian subsidies made available by Mussolini. The affinities between Degrelle's ideas and Mussolini's were close. The same national activist appeal, the same slogans of national revival, the same popular following in strongly Catholic countries. But the personal sympathy between the two men was even greater. Mussolini, who thought that Degrelle resembled him, intervened several times to smooth the younger man's path, allowing him to use the Italian radio when the Belgian government refused him time that other political formations had been allowed on the national broadcasting system, and probably preventing a papal condemnation of Rex. Degrelle, for his part, appreciated support from a regime he admired, but which was far enough away not to have any particular interests in Belgium. Hitler he admired, but somewhat distrusted. Mussolini he could afford to trust. He certainly could not have afforded to do without him. But who were those who backed Rex in Belgium? It would seem they were mainly the youth and the petty bourgeoisie of a Catholic country who were hit by the Depression, disgusted by the impotence of the ruling parties, and even more by the squalid corruption that Rex's campaigns revealed. Working-class support, eagerly sought, was thinner, but Degrelle's persistence and his courage in confronting the working-class public of the industrial and mining regions won him some adherents, and a great factory center like Charleroi elected a Rexist in 1936. It was not the only town to do so. Verviers elected 2 Rexist deputies, Liège 3 deputies, and 2 senators, one of them a sometime socialist syndicalist. Altogether, in the elections of May 1936, 21 Rexist deputies, in brackets, out of 202, end brackets, and 12 senators were returned to Parliament. In the wake of the elections, in brackets, and inspired by similar events in France, end brackets, great strikes broke out, with their inevitable train of violence and grief. Degrelle's more respectable electors were shocked when, contrary to all expectations, their champion took the strikers' side, supporting their demands for a 40-hour week and instructing the Rexist group to vote in their favor, setting up soup kitchens and evacuation centers for miners' children, arguing that one must not fall into the trap of opposing just demands merely because of communist spokesmanship or communist-fomented violence. The conservative public waxed indignant, but Degrelle carried on. It was essential that the communists be dislodged from their privileged position as defenders of the people. In quotations, without the people, a party is nothing. The bourgeois comes and goes. He gives himself when all goes well and wets his trousers when things start to go badly. Then he takes off, with a wet behind. The real tough ones, the ones that hold good through thick and thin, because their attachment is not subordinated to the protection of material goods, are the people. Either you have the people with you, or you have nothing with you. End quotation. All this was disturbing, and when, in October 1936, Degrelle concluded a pact with the Flemish nationalists, whom most Walloons considered deeply subversive and recognized their federalist demands, fear spread that Rex might attempt a coup d'etat. Fear, and in some quarters hope, for important elements of the army, leading conservative politicians, and perhaps the king himself, would not have minded seeing such a coup succeed. Degrelle, however, was a legalist, and the revolution he proposed, at least at that particular time, was not to involve any but legal means. The diversity and inexperience of Rexist deputies made them useless for any task but that of disrupting parliamentary sittings, but the movement's following was growing, even in popular quarters, and in January 1937, Degrelle filled the Palais des Sports, Brussels' Madison Square Garden, night after night for a week. Failure. Confident that in fresh elections Rex was bound to win at least a controlling minority of seats, Degrelle now tried to force the moderate leftist government of Premier Van Zeeland to dissolve Parliament and proceed to new elections. In February 1937, he faced Van Zeeland in a by-election in Brussels, designed to achieve that very end, but he lost. All the forces of conservatism had joined against him, from the communist advocates of a moderate popular front to the Catholics, admonished by the Belgian primate, Cardinal Van Ruy, that it would be a sin even to abstain. Against Van Zeeland's 275,000, Degrelle got only 69,000 votes. Rex seemed to have been a flash in the pan. In the elections of 1939, although Degrelle himself was returned in Brussels with the greatest majority of any deputy, the Rexist group in Parliament had been reduced from 21 to 4. The Liberals and the Catholics were recapturing the voters they had lost. Above all, Degrelle's insistent pacifism and neutralism in the wake of Munich and on the eve of impending war was turning Belgian patriots against him, some of them even within Rex itself. Only the German occupation, in brackets 1940 to 1944, end brackets, would bring Rex into its own again. Occupation and collaboration. In June 1940, Henri de Man, leader of Belgian labor, dissolved his party and advised his followers, in quotations, "War has brought the downfall of the parliamentary regime and of capitalist plutocracy in the so-called democracies. For the working classes and for socialism, this collapse of a decrepit world, far from being a disaster, comes as a liberation." End quotation. Nazi friends of Degrelle and of de Man, in the socialist and internationalist circles connected with Otto Abets, tried to give Belgium a government headed by the two men, but their scheme failed before opposition from more conservative quarters. So, at the outbreak of the German War in Russia, in brackets 1941, end brackets, Degrelle joined the Legion of Walloon Volunteers, which Rex helped the Germans raise for the Eastern Front. Some of the Legion's most enthusiastic volunteers seem to have come from the ranks of ex-communists, in brackets, several hundred of whom followed Degrelle to Russia, end brackets, and from the socialist combat organization Jeunes Gardes Socialistes, which had been Rex's fiercest foes before the war. In quotations, "There were no fiercer enemies of fascism than these rugged men," end quotations, recalled Degrelle. In quotations, but, when you came down to it, no one was better prepared for the violence of the regimes they liked to brand with infamy. The socialist youth had ideals. It burned to join us in creating a powerful socialism. End quotations. A German victory would fulfill their dreams of international unity and of social revolution. Europe, Degrelle argued, in quotations, must be won in order to carry out the National Socialist Revolution under the aegis of the SS. End quotation. But, though he may have been a European, Degrelle remained a Belgian nationalist. His dreams revived the childhood memories of a Greater Burgundy, and, behind it, Lotharingia, a realm in which Belgians would play the leading role. In Germany's new Europe, a people's role and rank would depend on the regard the Nazis had for it. Military valor was the way to Hitler's favor, distinction in battle the only means to win German respect. And, in a sense, his calculation was correct. Enlisted as a simple soldier, commissioned in the field and 5 times wounded, at the war's end, Degrelle achieved the rank of a division commander. He was decorated for his bravery with the highest German order, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, by Hitler himself. Degrelle had won the confidence and the respect of the Führer and of his aides, who destined him to rule in Belgium, and perhaps also in a Greater Burgundy. But such hard-won successes sank without trace, along with the Führer's fortune. Of the original Walloon contingent of 850, only 3 men survived. All told, after 3 years fighting, 2,500 Walloons had left their bones on the Eastern Front and on the long way back. Degrelle himself made his escape by a hair-raising flight from Norway to Spain on VE night, and there, in brackets, or elsewhere, end brackets, survives, turning out memoirs highly embarrassing to Belgian politicians, a man whose dynamism and burning ambition twice raised him very close to the power he coveted, only to dash him down again.